This is the Reptile Show Reporter scheduled live show. And let's see, I don't have my thing up. Let's see, graphics.
That's okay. I can dance. The music's in my mind.
All right, I know, but you know what needs to be on. Wait a minute, the music stopped, and I'm still dancing. All right, welcome adventurers again. It's Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. At least that's what my phone is telling me. My body thinks I don't know, I think it thinks it's 10 o'clock at this point. It's been a long week. I'm on sort of semi-vacation, but also a work trip. So I always turn these work trips into vacations somehow. But anyways, with me today, Bill Strand, the headmaster of the Chameleon Academy, as always, and special guest, Sarah. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Why don't you introduce yourself?
Hey guys, my name is Sarah Kelehear. I've been a moderator and the Chameleon enthusiast for probably 3 years. Does that sound right to you guys?
About right, yeah.
Yeah, it sounds right.
Yeah, okay, good. In my professional life, I work as an ecologist for an environmental consulting firm, and I live in Atlanta, Georgia.
All right, so what does an ecologist do, for goodness sakes?
So I am kind of a different type of ecologist, I guess, than what people probably think of when they hear that word. I actually work primarily for the state is like our main client. I work for a private company, but the private company consults out, which is where that environmental consultant name comes from.
Mm-hmm.
And our main client here in the state is GDOT, which is the Georgia Department of Transportation.
Okay.
So basically, in a short and sweet description, what I do is anytime that a road is built, a roundabout, a bridge installed, anything like that, my company sends me out and I go look for protected species of animals and plants, and I look for resources that can include streams, wetlands, anything like that. In the project area is what we call it, which basically means the area that is buffered around the construction site. And we make sure that the construction isn't going to impact any kind of federally or state listed animals or plants, and that any kind of resources aren't going to be affected, or if they are, that the proper minimization is done and they're kind of paying for that as much as they should, basically.
All right. Hey,
well, I'm just wondering, how do you determine whether it's going to affect? I mean, obviously, if you dig a big hole and pave it over, it's gonna affect it. But what is the threshold for affecting?
Yeah, so that's a good question. It definitely depends on the animal or plant. So any kind of animal or plant, I'm sure you guys have heard of this before, have what we deem critical habitat. So to give you an example, a gopher tortoise isn't going to consider my yard critical habitat.
Okay.
So a lot of things that we look at I'm just going to continue to use gopher tortoise as the example. For gopher tortoises, we look at a certain soil criteria. We look at kind of vegetative communities. So like, is it scrubland? Is it thick pine? Is it longleaf pine? And then based on that and based on the soil and based on the resources we find, then we deem the area habitat or not habitat for those species.
Okay.
Wow.
So
that's really complicated.
Kind of complicated, yeah. There's a lot of reporting involved, a lot of writing, a lot of consulting with the Army Corps and also with state agencies and things like that too to make those decisions.
All right. Well, that's great. Okay.
Thanks, yeah.
I didn't know that much about what we were up to and what you're doing. All right. Before we start, Bill, any announcements? I know there must be some because I saw that something about the Panther Chameleon podcast or something like that.
Everybody knows I
started or whatever. Or
yeah. Well, I started a Panther Chameleon podcast specifically for beginners of Panther Chameleons, and last time you asked me this question, I talked about switching directions 3 times and writing about 11 podcasts that are now not being used, and so, but I'm back on track. So you can go to any Spotify or any other major podcast player and find the Panther Chameleon podcast. It's for people who are beginners and wanting to learn. And so it's more tutorial than the Chameleon Academy, which is philosophical, and we talk about things that we don't know.
Okay. So what version is this, Bill? I said 200, but it's only 4?
It's only the 4th version, okay?
Okay.
We're
But the
not into
first 3 are
triple
not
digits yet.
available to anyone in the public domain. So it's still first version out, but it's
Yeah,
but it's
if you go there now, you won't realize how many times I've redone it.
okay. All right.
But
So this
also,
mhm,
I did get my new light from Thrive Ecosystems.
mhm.
Anybody want to see what happens when I plug this in? I don't
I
know.
do.
All right.
All right. Whoa! Hey, I think Kelly needs more. Sarah
All
needs
right.
one
Yeah,
of
it
those.
works.
I was gonna say, send me a couple.
All right.
Unfortunately, the area I'm in the house has like only lamps and no overhead lighting, which is nice for like ambiance, but not great when you're trying to record a video.
Okay, that's okay. We'll accept it. We can hear you, which is much better than we've had in the past. We've had many people who we could see but couldn't hear, which
Always been
sometimes that's good. But when you're doing a live show where you're talking to the guest and it's important what they're saying, being able to see and not hear is not a great thing. So, anyways, okay. So,
She's always been a shadowy, mysterious figure. Yeah, this is.
I
par for
guess
the
that's
course.
probably it, right? Okay. All right. So the Reptile Show reporter into our second, actually probably third week of. Oh, there's my puppy in the background. Both of my dogs are with us today on our trip. I don't know how I went crazy and decided we'd take dogs along, but anyways, hopefully it's still be quiet in the background, or I'll have to mute my my microphone and then I'll be able to talk. So you won't be able to hear me, which is probably good. But we went through and we've gone through pillar number 3. Today is Wednesday, the third pillar. So we went pillar 4, pillar 3, pillar 2, pillar 1 will be tomorrow. Our pillars, if you remember, number 4 is the attendees. Number 3 is the show itself. Number 2 is the vendors, and tomorrow the potential pets. So I was I don't know what you'd call it on number 3 this week. I was in Pittsburgh. Unfortunately, my car broke down in Pittsburgh, and we were there overnight. So I took a picture of a place that actually has a show. I thought I was going to go see a show, and it ended up not being the right weekend because the sign was still up. So we're going to go back in September and see that show. But I use that show as the week, so we don't have much. The vendor, we use our vendors from other times. So, but we're going to keep doing those. But posts on my brain is like going 100 miles an hour. My mouth is not, or maybe my mouth is going 100 miles an hour. My brain's not. One of the two is not going right. But we're going to be. And the puppy keeps going, so it's distracting me. All right, so we'll start all over again. So on Facebook, we're going to keep doing that every week. Monday will be the attendees. Tuesday will be the show. Wednesday will be the vendors, and Thursday will be the potential pets. Because for some reason, I looked it up, and those 4 days are the biggest days for people to look at on Facebook. I don't know why, because you'd think they'd be Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday when people are available and around, but apparently that's not when the best days of post are.
Well,
I'm not sure. Bill, do you think that makes sense? Or
well, yeah, because I release a podcast on Friday, I have a live on Saturday, and they're recovering on Sunday. I mean,
okay, all right.
a lot going on Friday,
in
Saturday,
recovery,
Sunday.
you mean they're at a recovery center because they've drank so much because they had to get through the podcast,
They're contemplating.
Contemplating all the wise things and all the thoughts that you have. They have to do all day Sunday.
It's pretty heavy, Sean.
All right. It sounds good. All right. So our topic today is pets. Should we get them from the wild? And what do I mean by the wild? Well, Sarah just talked about the wild in Georgia. Should we just grab a gopher tortoise and take it home with us on our way through Georgia? I'm here in Virginia. Should I grab something from Virginia? There's a bunch of beautiful turtles that are in the pond. I guess they're not wild, but they're in the pond by me here. It's a fountain or what have you. Should I take them home with me? Is that a good idea? How do I help? How does that help the ecology? I'm sure the ecologist is going to have a version of this that's probably even more steep than mine towards the no. But we'll go ahead and give her an opportunity to talk once I get done talking about it. And then secondly, we're going to talk about, do we get wild caughts, and when do we get wild caughts, and what are good or wild caughts, and who should have them? So, Sarah, any thoughts so far?
There's a lot to talk about. Go ahead. We're gonna sit back
We're just
and
going to
have a
sit back
White
and
Claw or
relax
something.
here and listen to you.
Oh, great. I was going to say you're throwing a lot at me right out the bat. So I probably have a little bit more extreme views on this than I think just like the general hobbyist would, I would say. But I think it's kind of an interesting perspective, hopefully, to other people, since I'm kind of seeing like the conservation side of it a little bit and like the hobbyist side also, because I'm both. At the end of the day, I keep animals, and I also work in like a conservation based industry, kind of.
Mhm.
So I guess my stance is probably a little bit more hardcore than just your basic hobbyist. Ideally, in a world that was perfect, we wouldn't have any wild caught animals in captivity. But also, how do you get an animal in captivity if it doesn't at some point come from the wild? At the end of the day, that's just kind of how it is. Any animal that you have in captivity at some point came from wild ancestors. And you have animals in captivity now that have generations that have been captive bred, like, I don't know, ball pythons or something as an example. And then you have some animals that haven't been in captivity that long or haven't been established in captivity. And so you see those a lot more being wild caught. And so obviously there is an industry for wild caught animals, and that's going to continue whether it's regulated or not. I am in favor of regulation for it because I think it's important to manage things like the number of individuals being taken, their numbers in the wild, their conditions, things like that. And at the end of the day, it's going to happen one way or another. I think it being regulated through CITES and organizations like that is probably the best thing for it. And at the end of the day, I think people are still going to get those animals, but I would say that I would rather those animals go to people who have the experience and aren't just at an expo and see it on a table and think, hey, Savannah monitor, cute, tiny. This will be a great pet for my 8-year-old child. When at the end of the day, that's going to be a giant lizard that's going to need a lot of intense husbandry.
So wait a minute. You don't think an 8-year-old child should have a Savannah monitor?
Not really.
I remember when I was 8, I could have dealt with a Savannah monitor. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
So I've just remembered to turn the chat on. So Stephanie Payne, welcome. Who's this? Let's see. James Cross, welcome. And so I think this was, I don't know who this was. Oh, Steph. That's awesome, Sarah. We need more like you out there. And so all the positive stuff for this. So, Bill, what are your thoughts about what Sarah had to say?
Well, I'm interested. Sarah, are you familiar with the laws within the United States regulating keeping native animals?
Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with the ones in Georgia, which is where I live. I actually used to work for a state agency, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and they actually are the ones who make a lot of those laws and do a lot of the permitting for animals and things like that. So those I'm definitely familiar with from my state. And I'm decently familiar with like federal ones as well, but I would say definitely more for state.
Well, let's start off with the basics. What are the general regulations as far as keeping native animals?
So Georgia actually has stricter ones than some other states. For Georgia, you actually cannot keep any kind of native non-venomous snake in Georgia. Weirdly, you can keep hot species in Georgia. So you can have a timber rattlesnake, but you can't have a corn snake.
Well, they're trying to thin out the hobbyist population.
That makes perfect sense.
It's a little interesting, but that is the rule for Georgia. They also have certain species that have been, I guess, like banned, or there's not laws to keep them for a long time. And that includes things like big cats, any kind of more hardcore exotic, I guess you could say, like anything that's really dangerous, like larger hoof stock like rhinos and stuff like that, exotic cats, elephants. So you can't have basically like any of the more dangerous animals in Georgia like you can in some other states. I think Texas and maybe Ohio, where you're from, Sean, have a little bit more lax rules with exotics.
Not really. No, I mean,
No, okay.
they're a little bit more relaxed. There used to be you could have anything you wanted, but
Yeah.
now it's all permitted. All the stuff, the
Okay.
big cats, the tigers, lions, bears, all allowed, but they must be permitted. They're a little bit more lax with snakes, but these are still native things they don't allow you to keep.
Yeah.
Even the red ear slider, which really, and I talked to Two Turtle Tom about this, I think in my podcast, which hasn't come out yet, that it was not really even native to Ohio. There was just one island and one river next to the Pennsylvania border that was there, and it's now native. But it's I don't know why it's protected, because there's tons of them. They're everywhere, and they're in every single rescue. There's like the Rescue by Me has hundreds of them, because people, they get them in a the size you're supposed to be allowed to have them, and they grow huge and they live forever. But yeah, Ohio is gotten a little bit better about it, a little bit more reasonable, a little bit more. I think it makes sense, and snakes are not banned per se based on size or type, but if you get a snake that's 13 feet or longer, you need to get a permit for it, which makes sense.
Yeah.
If you have a 13-foot snake, they should probably know who has it and where they're at. And hot stuff, not stolen, but stuff that's venomous, is also needs to be permitted and gets inspected. But I think the crazy thing is that red-eared sliders, you need a permit for, and they can come and inspect you.
Oh yeah,
it's like,
you can actually have
okay.
red-eared in Georgia, but I don't know if you can sell them. But I know that you can have one. And a lot of people that have them, a lot of times they are rescues because of the same thing. And they're not native to this area either. I think the drainage basin they're native to is like in Louisiana, Mississippi, I want to say. But you can see them at any pond in Georgia just about.
What is the logic behind saying you can't keep native species? It just would seem more logical to say you can't keep these other species that don't belong here, because if you keep something native and it gets out, no problem. And I mean, I can see you can't sell it. You can't move it across state lines. Maybe you can sell it within the state, but not across state lines. What's the logic?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think this rule has actually been in effect for a long time in Georgia. Pretty much as soon as I heard about the regulations, which at this point was probably at least 6 years ago, that was the rule, and it's been the rule ever since. And I know that pertains to Georgia's native snakes. I don't know if it pertains to turtles and some other ones. I know that there are ones that are prohibited, like map turtles, and some of the other ones that are state listed. But in Georgia, I think the mindset is mainly that you can't prove where it came from. So you could basically go outside and collect 10 corn snakes in a certain area and have those. And they could say, where'd you get those corn snakes? And you could say, oh, I bought them. But they could be wild collected. So I think that's part of the motivations for it, is protecting the native populations, and not necessarily, if you can't prove where it came from. I think it's more to protect those species than anything else.
I'm still having trouble.
So Two Turtle Tom is here. I muted myself because my dogs are still going at it and loud. But Two Turtle Tom is here, and he's it's all about control, Bill. I think that's very true.
Yeah, but control of what?
Yeah, I will say, so there's definitely, we get that a lot. I've heard that a lot too. I don't necessarily think that's true. I mean, I've worked in conservation and for state agencies and stuff, and it's not necessarily about that. It's more encouraging people not to kill native animals in terms of snakes. It's also illegal in Georgia to kill. It's also illegal in Georgia, to kill any non-venomous snake. You can't actually do that in Georgia. Not necessarily that it's regulated all the time, but that is a rule in Georgia too, that you can't kill a non-venomous snake. No, and then we also have seen a lot of the effects that Florida has seen from introduced non-native animals as well in our native populations because of that, primarily in Burmese pythons with the pentostomes. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but that's become an issue in Georgia. And then more recently, tegus too. We're starting to see those in South Georgia as well.
Well, yeah. So I can understand regulating those, but I just still don't see the logic in saying you can't keep native species. Okay.
The snake one has been around for a long time. I'm assuming that that's where it comes from, is the general you can't prove where it came from, if it came from the wild or not. And then I'm assuming just the same thing, that people will be less likely to kill them. I'm not quite sure, but it's been around for a long time.
So Two-Turtle Tom is also saying the Wildlife Agency wants to control the wildlife. And actually he's got some shall we say, experience in that realm as well. So he's also, although he's more of a tree guy, he's at the harbor, the Hold'em Arboretum now, and the I can't even think of the other place that's connected to it, but he's been part of the wildlife and the different things. So he's got some experience. All right, here's what he's got. He's a 22-year veteran of Ohio Department of Natural Resources. If too many people keep natives, the Wildlife Agency loses control of the population they consider their own. So that's an expert's opinion, Bill. I don't know. It may not be your opinion, but whether that's right or wrong. But so why don't you tell us about California? For goodness sakes, California is crazy.
Yeah, California's, I mean, you can keep anything here in California as long as it's nothing. So we don't even consider, we're lucky. I can keep chameleons and exotic species, but yeah, anything, we can't keep natives, and definitely not ferrets, sugar gliders, and hedgehogs, and all the fun stuff that you're keeping for me.
Heaven forbid the sugar gliders go wild and have a party in California.
We have a huge fruit industry, and they are just, don't keep anything that eats fruit. We can't keep certain parrots and things like that.
I think Georgia, actually, we can't keep sugar gliders or hedgehogs either.
Wait a minute. Don't cats and dogs eat fruit? Or, I mean, a little bit, or get into that?
Not to the same extent, I don't think. But I don't really understand those two. Those never really made sense to me.
I think cats are considered the most invasive species in America. So my dog's backing me up on that one. I think she said, yes, that's true. There she is again, barking at us. But
yeah, cats definitely do a lot more damage to native species than I would think a sugar glider would. But
all right, so we have those laws in effect. How do you have any feel for how they are enforced? How do you enforce somebody not keeping something native in their house?
Sometimes people turn them in because they realize that they had something that they didn't realize they weren't supposed to have, which I used to have that happen a lot. When I worked for the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, we would do programs and outreach and stuff like that. And, I might do a program and I talk about native snakes, or I might talk about a box turtle or something like that. And then we have actually had like teachers and educators and parents and random people come to us and say, I didn't realize I've had a box turtle, for 2 years. Can I relinquish it to you? And they have actually turned in the animals they have had for some time and maybe didn't know that they weren't supposed to have that.
Okay.
And then those animals are not euthanized. They go on to become education animals for Georgia Department of Natural Resources usually, or another AZA, or basically an institution who can provide the permitting necessary to keep them.
So you have zoos that have native wildlife?
Yeah, actually, I used to work at the Tennessee Aquarium in Chattanooga, and we had 2 box turtles that were surrenders, actually, from people that had them that didn't really know what they were doing, taking care of them. Unfortunately, they look pretty rough. I'm not sure if you've ever seen box turtles that have had pretty improper husbandry, but malformed shells, really long beaks, long nails, and they look kind of sad. But they do make a good education animal because of that, because you can kind of talk about how it's a complicated species with a lot of complicated husbandry needs, and why you shouldn't go into your backyard maybe and take a box turtle home.
Okay.
All right, let's change the topic to wild caughts from other countries. What do you think about that? I think you kind of put a little bit on it, but boy, lady is like just barking away, and I don't know why. But anyway, she just turned 1 over the weekend. I don't know. I think she wasn't supposed to be a puppy anymore, but apparently she doesn't know it. So I apologize for that, Sarah. Anything more about the? No, she stopped because I'm talking bad about her. What about wild caught from other areas?
Yeah, so I mean, I keep chameleons. Obviously, I'm a hobbyist too. I have a couple species of frogs. I have some leopard geckos, kind of basic stuff, and then some more complicated stuff. So obviously, I'm a hobbyist at heart, and I've kept animals for a while now. And like I said, at the end of the day, like animals are going to be wild caught at some point to be in the hobby at all. At some point, any animal you have, even a dog, was wild. Maybe not yours, Sean. Sounds pretty yappy. But at one point, they have wild ancestors. So I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with wild caught if it's done correctly and the population is stable and there is a population to draw from to begin with, because at the end of the day, you need those genetics to keep a healthy and sustainable population in captivity as well. So I think at some point, you can get enough captive bred animals to where it doesn't necessarily need to be happening on a regular basis anymore. But I definitely think for some of those animals that maybe are doing well in the wild, but don't necessarily have a captive bred kind of like pool in the hobby, eventually you're going to have to bring some from the wild. I don't know if I'm doing a good job explaining this.
So what are the dangers of bringing in wild caught animals from foreign areas?
Yeah, so there's a bunch. Obviously, one of the main things is just the stress on the animal. I'm sure if you guys have ever seen wild caught animals, which if you've ever been to any kind of expo, you have, if you look at them closely, you can tell immediately which ones are wild caught. If they're looking a little dehydrated, their eyes are sunken in, they've got some scars and some scratching on them. Maybe their colors are a little off. I mean, chances are they're probably a wild caught animal. And, I think the main thing that concerns me is just the stress that the animal goes through. And it's reasonable. They're traveling from another country, overnight and not necessarily ideal conditions. A lot of times there's not a lot of, prep done before they're shipped and not a lot of acclimation done. And I think a lot of times this is why these animals are kind of in rough shape when they get here. In terms of risk, I'd say probably that's the most concerning to me is just the pressure it puts on wild populations that maybe aren't doing so good for some of those animals that you see becoming really popular that have really complicated husbandry needs, or just animals in general that don't have a very robust population to begin with, or are susceptible to diseases, or maybe are susceptible to carrying certain diseases. Those are probably the ones that concern me the most.
Okay. And so how do they affect the natural native populations?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. A lot of the big amphibian and reptile diseases that we have seen pop up and kind of become global have either origins in the captive pet trade industry or have been kind of exacerbated by the pet trade to some degree. This one was actually kind of more, I guess, like science research based, but I'm sure you guys have probably heard of chytrid fungus and bee sow. Those are two that have become prevalent in the last couple of years and have done a lot of devastation to primarily Central and South American amphibians. But some of the carriers for those are animals like bullfrogs or animals like the African clawed frog, which I'm sure if you guys have ever been to a pet store, you've probably seen a little African clawed frog and with the fish in the corner. And those two species in particular aren't particularly affected by chytrid, but they're carriers for it. And those are two species that have also become established wild in areas that they're not native to. If you've ever been out west, you know that bullfrogs have become really established out west and they're not native there. They're native here in the southeast where I live. But those are actually animals that can spread those diseases. And same with African clawed frogs. They're also carriers and they can spread it pretty easily, but they don't necessarily feel the effects like some of the other native species do.
Okay.
I think that also not only is it to the natural species that are around, but it's also to your other collection. So if you have more than one reptile, more than one exotic pet, you may be endangering them by getting wild caughts and not quarantining them properly and treating them properly. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. Coccidia is one that is an intestinal parasite, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's one that can be really devastating in captive populations. If you get in a wild caught animal that has that, it can spread through a collection and make all your other animals sick. And I mean, a robust, either like wild caught established animal or a captive bred animal is probably going to handle that a little bit better than a fresh wild caught. But it's still something that can be really devastating to your collection. And same with like I'm probably going to say this wrong, filarial worms, I think is how you say it, that you see in chameleons sometimes, or your subcutaneous worm. You can actually like see them underneath the skin or in the eye. I'm pretty sure those are contagious too through feces. They can shed the eggs, and then they could pick up from the other animals in your collection, and they could end up with those too. So there's definitely risk involved if you have any kind of wild caughts. And I would say if you do acquire wild caught, or you want to add some genetic variability to your bloodlines, I would definitely put those through a strict quarantine procedures if I had them in my collection.
And we've talked about quarantine before on the show, but some people say 30 days. I like to do 90 days of quarantine. Mm-hmm. I like to test the stool. I like to have 2 negative stools before I bring them out of quarantine. And realistically, I leave my animals in quarantine until I need the quarantine cages to take them out because they thrive very well because the cages you can't see into the quarantine cages because that's the way I've had them so they don't see you. And so they do very well in those quarantine cages because they're, but I have to add plants as time goes on once I'm sure that they're doing well. But I don't get to enjoy them quite as much because they're quarantined. But still, I don't do a lot of that, and I only do it to increase my genetic diversity, and I'm breeding all the species that I get that are wild caught. So, and that's not many.
Yeah. I think we have a good question, Sean, if you want to read that one. I just saw it in the chat. I don't know.
So far as rules for chameleons, are the guidelines or rules more based on import law? They are allowed as pets, so I would think that the regulations on importing them, I have not heard of any for breeding or keeping in the States that I know of. I don't know who sent this one, but so Facebook users, let me just put this up here so you can see that I don't actually have it here. I don't know. Well, anyways, Facebook users, please announce who you are on every post so we know who you are. But I don't know. Bill, do you want to take this, or Sarah, do you prefer? Or
I can take it. Well, we can figure out. I think we can figure out who this is.
I'm trying to look.
Yeah. Okay. So chameleons are covered under CITES since they are foreign based for the most part. They are covered under CITES, and CITES is the Convention for the International Trade of Endangered Species. And CITES has a number of levels. Almost all chameleons are CITES 2, which means that there are quotas. And so Madagascar will do a scientific study that says this population is stable enough if we only take 500 individuals out of this population a year, or 2,000, 1,000. Those kind of numbers. And sometimes it can get down to 5. We have some quotas that are down at 5 or 2. So that is what is accepted as how many can go out of the country. And since the United States and Madagascar are signatories of CITES, that means that the United States agrees that we only allow in the chameleons that have CITES paperwork. Now that's say maybe 1,000 going out of Madagascar. So that's 1,000 spread out across the entire world. So we may just get 200 a year in. And so they are regulated as to how many come into the States. Now, as for I don't know that there's a whole lot of which laws there are in different areas in the States that restrict chameleons. Florida, I do know Hawaii won't allow any chameleons in because they did that once, and now there's chameleons being invasive all over Hawaii. And so they said it's illegal to ship any chameleons out of Hawaii. And that's why we had this big influx of Jackson's chameleons. and then because they were coming in from Hawaii, and then it was cut off, at least officially. We still get in a lot of those Hawaiian Jackson's chameleons from who knows where. There are suspicions, but anyway, let's just say it's illegal to do that. And the reason why they did that in Hawaii is because they didn't want more people releasing things in Hawaii to collect and send to the States. So some people say, if they want to get rid of the Jackson's chameleons, why don't they just allow people to grab them and take them? Well, if they allow that, then people will send veiled chameleons over there so they can take those, and they'll just use which somebody has. And so this is why Hawaii says, no, we're not going to let you do this. So those are the kind of regulations that are around chameleons. Now, there may be some local regulations for exotic species, but that I don't know of those. And
I think they're, Bill, you need to remember that people need to look into their city, their county, their state, for whatever animals that they're limiting there, so that you don't bring things that aren't allowed, because each individual municipality could actually make a rule.
Yeah.
As stupid as the rules may sound, or as necessary as the rules may be, outlawing chameleons in Ohio would probably be ridiculous, because they know they'd never make it through the winter. I don't know of any species who could make it through the actual winter when it's 4 inches of snow and well, don't forget Homeowners Association. True Turtle Tom is saying, I don't know.
Lots of levels of bureaucracy in
I
our
like
world.
to forget about my Homeowners Association. I might be moving because of it, but nonetheless, I got sidetracked by his comment, which was really funny. Thanks, Tom. but it's important to know what's allowed in your area and what's not. And sometimes it doesn't make any sense, but other times, like I understand tegus being not legal in some areas where they can live and be destructive. I understand huge snakes, anacondas and things like that. And I would understand being able to figure out who has them or where they're at and watch them and whatever. I don't understand what happened. And I won't even go into it with the Florida wildlife thing a few weeks ago, but that I don't understand at all. But it doesn't make any sense to euthanize something where people want them, and can have them somewhere that's legal. But I went into it. Sorry. All right, I'll let you get back to it. Bill, what were you going to say?
Oh, and I do not know of any regulations against breeding them. So they're not. Now, Florida, I wouldn't be surprised if they try to come up with something.
Florida's like the Wild West.
I don't know what's going on down there, and so, but we all got to watch out, because there's always legislation trying to keep people from doing something. We have a lot of power plays going on at all levels of government, and one of them is whether you can keep animals or not, any kind. Doesn't matter if there's a real ecological reason behind it. Monologue done.
All right, so I'm muting my my mic on and off as my puppy's kind of get going crazy. I don't know why she doesn't bark this much ever, but they're like a little crazier. There's two of them in here, and I think that may be it. So they're torturing my wife as I'm trying to do this show. But anyways, too much information, I'm sure, but you can hear it in the background. But so any other thoughts on these phenomenon, Bill? Last thoughts, or
which phenomena
on the wild caught rules, laws? I mean, anything else as a whole, the whole topic. Should we be
rules, laws,
and should there be laws and rules about it? I think there should, but
yeah, the problem with the rules and the laws is they're not written by people who want to be reasonable about it. They're written by people with ulterior motives to, it's not just, okay, we're going to get rid of cobras. We'll get rid of everything possible. And so there's a lot of motivations behind it that are not in good faith. And so that's why we have to fight so much. But yeah, if I could actually, if we could have a world where we actually got together and we made legislation that made sense, that took into account protection of native wildlife, took into account the care of the animals coming in. I mean, if we were in a society where legislation was written in good faith, I would absolutely support, because I mean there's some realistic things that I say, yeah, I want people who keep cobras, I'd like that to be tightly controlled. I really do. I don't want my neighbor having a cobra that doesn't have the right cage. And how do we determine what the right cage is? Okay, well, somebody's got to figure out what that is. And then somebody's got to say, okay, you have a license to keep a cobra, and we're going to check on you every so often, whatever it is to make sense. I don't know what that is, but something like that done in good faith. And then the problem is, once you have those laws, even if they're done in good faith, 10 years from now, they're not going to be used in good faith. And so this is, I don't even know what to say I support or I want, because
Tom had a good comment too. I just saw in the chat that I agree with.
we have too many great captive bred animals to still have so many imported wild caught reptiles in the pet trade. Well, I would love to see, if we start going into things outside of dangerous reptiles, things like chameleons, I would love to see a regulation as to who can keep wild caught chameleons. I'd love to see it saying, all right, let's say you want to be a breeder. If you want to be a breeder, then you are able to keep wild caught, say, chameleons or reptiles, if you have this level of experience. Now, I mean, I can see how that can be abused by in a number of different ways, but in a perfect world, I think that would be a reasonable way. And yes, Europe does have regulations, and you do have to show that you have the correct husbandry. Now, the problem with that is who's in charge of what's correct husbandry? And
you are, Bill.
yeah, if that was the case, okay, we're good. But yeah, it's like I saw some guide coming out of Europe, and I think it was a hobbyist put together. It was a guide of the correct regulations for chameleons, and the cage was this many times the body length and this high, but those regulations assumed that the chameleons enjoy vertical pillar type cages. That's incorrect. The reason why we have vertical pillar type cages is because it's easier to manufacture those, and it's cheaper to manufacture those. That's not what chameleons need. But this regulation, this booklet regulation, wasn't done by people who recognized why we have 2x2 by 4 foot as a standard, the pillar cages as a standard. And so that's an example of how putting together regulations for something as diverse as reptiles means you need a whole lot of people who are experts. And I will say, I know chameleons because I do chameleons day in, day out. I don't know anything about dart frogs. Don't get me on the committee for dart frogs or geckos, and put me on the committee for chameleons. But it's the same thing. You can't have someone who's a reptile generalist putting together these standards for all the different specific species. So there's none of this is easy. All right.
Sarah, your thoughts?
Yeah, I kind of echo what Bill said. I would like to see some, better kind of overall, not necessarily regulations, but just guidelines in general for husbandry and things like that across the community. But I think at the end of the day, that comes down to the community members, not necessarily the state agencies too. I think it's important to hold others in the hobby accountable And by kind of collectively, hopefully raising our standards, maybe we can get somewhere like that one day.
I think not purchasing things that aren't treated well, that are, that from people who don't do things right. But that's us in the community getting out to those people who walk into a show and don't know what they're doing. They see the chameleon that was wild caught for $50, and they don't come to the store, the stand where they're all captive bred. They go for price over quality because they don't know quality. They don't understand that, that creature's dehydrated, and it's, and they don't have a cage. They don't have something prepared for it. They take it home in the box and they figure out what to do, and it probably dies before they get it into what it needs to be in. So yeah, I totally agree. I think that there needs to be some type of regulation, but I think it needs to start with us in the community. People like Bill, who for chameleons, other people for different reptiles, and just go from there. And that we need to set an example, and I guess ostracize those people. If only there was someone in Northeast Ohio so captive bred chameleons. Yeah, sure. I'm sure there's one at least. I'm in Northeast Ohio, and yes, I'm selling captive breds. But but I think it's all important. So, any other thoughts, Sarah?
No, I mean, I think, the pillars and the different communities out there, which luckily, Bill has had a lot of those kind of people on the podcast for different, things, frogs, monitor lizards, bearded dragons, anything like that. I think having those examples in the hobby and them kind of setting the standards and saying, hey, like, let's not show this animal in like this really sad bear enclosure. Let's try to replicate these naturalistic setups, or let's not buy the $50 reptile at the expo. Let's maybe try to find these breeders who are doing it right, and supporting them is really the best thing that we can do. Yeah.
All right. So, Bill, I know I said final thoughts 10 minutes ago, but my wife took the dogs out for a walk. So it'll be a little quiet, except for my daughters in here crabbing. So nonetheless.
You really want to push the on button on the Bill switch again?
No, I don't know if I want to push the on button on the Bill switch, but I'm just being polite before I cut everybody off and go on to the next week. I guess we're going to have the guy from that wasn't able to make it last week from the Toledo show. He was able to make it this week, but I'd already scheduled Sarah, so I told him next week would be good, and I'd be able to do it from home, and so we'll have reasonable internet and quiet. But I thought I wouldn't have reasonable internet in a hotel room, except for I had dogs that were barking away, so I didn't plan that very well. But I apologize.
Well, I will say, as a final thought for the people watching this podcast, wondering, okay, what are the actionable items after all of this stuff that we went through? Mm-hmm. And I think it would be a good example, a good ambassador of reptile keeping, and the invest in your cages, invest in those naturalistic setups, make it beautiful, and so you become something that other people outside the community can look at and say, wow, this is great, instead of, oh, how sad. And so that's what we can do as individuals. And if enough of us are doing that, we are touching enough people out there that we possibly can change opinions. And I think that's what we can do as individuals.
I think that too helps influence, to some degree, the kind of fear mongering that we see, from general public in terms of snakes and, some of the more dangerous or controversial species that you see in the hobby. And I think too, holding ourselves to those kind of standards will hopefully, make a better impression on state and federal agencies too, when they're looking at kind of the reptile hobby as a whole.
I agree.
Maybe.
And so
the giant cruelty cases and things that we see in the media sometimes with this industry, I feel like definitely don't do that any favors. Just my thought.
All right. So my final thought is just to echo Bill's, be a good example. do the best you can, change your little corner of the world, because honestly, that's all you can change is your little corner of the world, and hope that the others will follow you. And I've put 2 turtle times on since it's a positive, good conversation tonight. Thank you, Tom. We probably should have brought you in because you're always here. Nonetheless, I even went to a place out here in Virginia that had a hingeback
I noticed
street
that.
for him. I don't know if you saw it on Facebook. There's actually a hingeback drive here in what's called Turtle Landing, and it was like 1 mile from my hotel down here in Virginia. So I went out there and took some pictures and put it on Facebook. But anyways, all right. So we're off for this week, and we'll be back next week with someone from the Toledo Glass City Expo. Have a great day. Thanks, Sarah, for being here. Thanks, Bill,
Yeah,
again.
thank you guys for
Thank you,
having
Sarah.
me.